So this is our second part where we left off, and that was a very interesting thing that you were talking about, Joshua, about the vulnerability aspect. And, I would love to understand from you because I'm into coaching and I coach men, women from various domains. When it comes to vulnerability, I see a lot of men struggling with that aspect. So I'll just put the question very generic to you. What would you share something about vulnerability through your own experience?
Well, first, I don't think it's just men who struggle with vulnerability. I think men, if you look at it generally, can struggle with vulnerability, but women can often they can show vulnerable in some areas, then be not vulnerable in other areas. They can hide. They'll share about this, but then they won't share about that, and they'll hide. So there's different levels to vulnerability, and unfortunately, we would live in a society which can many times be business. These sorts of things can be predatory. You show vulnerability or you show weakness and somebody's going to use that against you. Even in personal relationships, that can happen. You think you can trust someone and you tell something, and on the surface, one thing that can happen is they go and tell everybody else, or later in an argument, they'll use it against you, or these sorts of things. And it seems like with social media and the way our lives are under focus in a way that they've never been before, that there's this theme of basically attacking people's vulnerability, or somebody makes one misspoken word or one phrase that's not quite right, and they're quick to cancel it. They're quick to get rid of them. And many times in that situation, if somebody misspeaks or they say something that's not phrased quite correctly, they can just come out and they say, listen, I misspoke. I said something incorrectly. People are quick to judge and want to form an opinion on somebody and make it us versus them. So vulnerability, to me, it comes in many, many layers. And specifically to men, or even to the people who are more masculinely inclined, it's not always a safe place to be vulnerable. It's not always a safe place to express yourself, to express how you're feeling, given the way society's developed, given the way everything that's going on. And I think in a lot of places, in India and in the US, and probably many other places in the world, there's this undercurrent of kind of forgotten men who are being raised with very little hopes or dreams, very little economic moving up economically, and the traditional structures are going away. The traditional ideas of what it is to be a man versus a woman are going away. And so, yes, there's a lot in the past that has been done by men. There's a lot of horrible things that have come from this kind of dominant patriarchal society, but it's not possible to move forward into a world we want to create without being inclusive. And I think in society now, there's this way of looking at it that men have been the dominant aggressor. They've been the ones who are perpetrating crimes. They've been the ones that have been doing this. And so now they just need to step aside and be quiet. And unfortunately, when you have that, and I see this amongst my friends and people I know, that place where you're just supposed to step aside and be quiet, these people are talking, these people have been oppressed, and the conversations need to happen. People need to be given a voice. But to say, well, you're not allowed to have an opinion, if you look at the US specifically politically, it's very clear that that's not a solution, because it creates these polarized segments of society. And then I think in general, men kind of struggle with defining and understanding their feelings at all, right? It's not even that expression or being vulnerable, it's defining and understanding and realizing what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're saying. So when it comes time to be vulnerable, when it comes time to open up, there's a certain strength in vulnerability. There's a certain, well, let me say it a different way. To be absolutely open and vulnerable, you have to be strong, because people can and will use that against you. People will use any aspect of who you are to gain an advantage. Everything's economically driven. So part of it is getting to a place where you're strong enough, you're stable enough that you can be vulnerable, you can be open, and you're not looking for something from the other person. And I think that's where this concept comes into, that men are like, well, I was open, I was vulnerable, and she did this to me, or he did this to me, or that. That's not the point. It's, I'm open, I'm vulnerable, I am expressing this. And maybe that leads to, in your head, that leads to like these wonderful things happening. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe the reality is that it does create a situation where you're taken advantage of, or where somebody treats you horribly, or if you're dating somebody and you're open and vulnerable, that person goes away, and that sort of stuff. And I'm not talking about being open and vulnerable as in all of a sudden I'm crying and all the time and this sort of stuff. It's just a matter of, you can say, okay, well, this is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. This is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm going after. And so for me, getting to a place where who I am and what's going on with me is not dependent on someone outside me, so I can have a moment of vulnerability. And vulnerability can take many forms. For instance, I have a dear friend who we're doing some business stuff together, and she has consistently been late to meetings. She's consistently done these sorts of things. And then recently she blew off a meeting, and it can be vulnerable to just say, this isn't okay. If I'm going to be in business with you, you have to hold yourself to a standard, because this is a friend. You could lose a friendship over it. That's part of the problem doing business with somebody. You could lose a friendship over it. So being vulnerable and open, and having that fear of, I could lose a friendship. I could, she might think I'm a jerk. She might think these sorts of things, but you just say, listen, this to me is the standard that I hold myself to. This is the standard that I hold you to. And that's simply what it is. Because if we end up in the business together, great. If we don't, great. And so getting to a place where you're stable, you're okay, regardless of what happens. My happiness, my security doesn't depend on this other person, right? And that actually feels a little bit crazy to people who are in marriages, because part of it is, well, if they're not dependent on me, they might leave me, right? Like there's that thing. But if you get yourself to a place where I'm okay, you're okay, and we're choosing to be together, we're choosing to see how we provide, as crass as this sounds, but you provide value, you provide, whether, even if the value is like, it's just a beautiful thing that's in my life, it's something that gives me a little more fragrance. But the way society is everybody's so quick to judgment. Everybody's so quick to, in terms of dating, I don't know how the dating apps are over in India, but you're out to dinner with somebody, and then you look the wrong way or something like that, and they're all of a sudden swiping. It's so quick. Everything is replaceable. Everything is one swipe away. You're looking for the next thing. It's so quick to move on. And I think part of that's a reaction of, before it was like, you're married, and you're with this person and that's it. And you don't have a choice. But now we have, there's a great book and I can't remember the name of it. It's like The Paradox of Choice. And now we have too many choices where you just are like, well, this person and we're gone and I'm never going to talk to you again. And so finding some balance where you get to talk and you get to be vulnerable and you get to lay yourself out there and trust that if the person leaves, that person wasn't really meant for you. If the business goes, maybe it's better. Maybe it's better that you didn't have to do business with that person. It doesn't seem that way. But getting to that strength inside where you can be stable and balanced and vulnerable and say, yeah, this is what I want. This is what I want. This is what I expect. These are the standards that I expect from you. Not just that, but this is how I feel. This is, say it is a relationship. This is what you bring. You know, so if you can look at somebody and see, wow, you add this stuff to my life and express that. I think we were talking about communication last time. If you can express what it is that the person brings to your life, I think that in communication, those are the things that don't get said. You know, I love that I get to come home and spend time with you after work. You know, it means so much to sit on the porch and watch a sunset, you know, these sorts of things, like the value that somebody brings. And that takes vulnerability, because even in a relationship, even if you're married, we have this fear of rejection. You know, we have this, oh goodness, I don't remember that book either. Oh, it's been so long since I've read it. But they did this study where it was on married couples, and they did this study, and I feel like it predicted divorce in something like 85% of couples that were going to get divorced. And part of it is you make an offer as a person, you make an offer as a partner. You say, well, I'd love, this is just an example, and it's not actually based on anything from the study. It's like, hey, I'd love to go to the gardens this weekend. And the person can either accept that offer and be like, oh yeah, that would be wonderful. That would be great. Maybe not this weekend, because you can even reject the offer, but accept the offer from the person. Maybe not this weekend because it's raining, but let's make sure that happens. Or you can, who wants to go to the gardens? What's there to do there? Right? So you either have this thing where you're coming together or you're going apart. And they did this study, and it seemed to be a really strong predictor of how a marriage would work if somebody's willing to be vulnerable, if the other person accepts it or if the other person rejects it. So in our masculine dominated society where it's all about economics, all about that, I feel like finding expression for that vulnerability, and as men, finding a way to embrace the feminine aspect of life and be vulnerable. I think it would take away, if that's supported and accepted, I think that would be something that would be, in some sense, a curative for some of the toxic masculinity. 200 years ago, there were men that wrote poetry and painted, and they were celebrated and did these beautiful things. India has a great history of men who are these artists and poets and all this sort of stuff. So now it just seems like the male worth is as a provider. And even then, the economics are so weird that, yes, some people do really, really well and some people don't.
Wow. You just opened up so many questions in my mind with respect to certain things that you mentioned. I will begin with the first one. In your life, and I'm talking about before your journey, you came into spirituality, or even after getting into it, what has been the most vulnerable situation, moment, or experience for you, and how did you handle it?
In my life, vulnerability wasn't okay. In my life, showing vulnerability my family left you open to mocking and teasing, and it wasn't something that was accepted. And or even tolerated. You know, you had to make yourself hard. You had to make yourself tough. You had to be, you know, I remember we were doing the, in the early days of Isha, they called me the soldier because I was just like this, you know, like they did that. And so there was a group of people that called me the soldier. I was always, you know, 3:30 a.m. I was in the Sadhguru 2:30 a.m. I would be in the Sadhguru, you know, these things. And so for me, having it be safe to be wrong. And there was a Swami who we were learning Angamarna. I learned Angamarna when I was living in the ashram in 2009. And then we learned it as part of a program in 2010. And it was taught differently. One of the steps was in a different order. So I went up to Swami and I said, Swami, I learned it here like this, and I learned it yesterday like this, which is correct? And he just looks, takes a moment. Oh, I made a mistake. I'll need to fix that. And to me, that left such an impact because he was willing to just say, oh, I made a mistake. It was such a simple thing for him to admit that he was wrong and then go up in front of everybody and say, oh, we did it this way. I got it incorrect. We're doing it this way, actually. And for him, it probably meant nothing. But for me, it was profound because admitting you're wrong and being okay with being wrong, being okay with, I made a mistake. What does it mean for me as a person? Nothing. Everybody makes mistakes. What does it mean for what I'm doing? It means absolutely nothing. So vulnerability is something that was kind of weaponized, and it's very weaponized in Western culture. You know, we'd constantly make fun of each other, my friends. And then trying to think of an answer to your question in terms of when was a very vulnerable time. I remember did I tell the story of getting hit by a car last time?
Yes, that's how it started.
I did. Okay. Yes. So when I got hit by a car, I had this friend next door, and I remember I went to the hospital, and then they brought me home. And like I had this bandage around my ankle, and I was just sitting out on the porch. At that time, I drank, so I was sitting out on the porch drinking a beer. And she came home, and she was like, "Oh my God, what happened?" And I told her, and she basically became my nurse for a couple of days. She would kind of like make sure everything was bandaged, make sure all this sort of stuff, and even letting somebody else take care of me in that sense, like that was a very vulnerable thing for me. Is to, you know, I was this Ironman triathlete. I thought I was, you know, these sorts of things. And I was studying for the MCAT. Actually, I just finished the MCAT. Actually, I did really well in the MCAT and thought I was invincible. And then all of a sudden, you know, for a couple of days, I'm not really able to walk up and down the stairs. And so she's helping me up and down the stairs. She's doing these things. And it just struck me, how if you allow yourself to be open to, I'll just call it grace. Like there's a certain amount of grace, but you can't be open to grace without vulnerability. You know, people think it's, well, I'm in grace and then I'll open up. And that's not the way it works. You have to like open yourself up and take that. You've seen trapeze artists, right? So they're hanging onto something.
Yes.
And they're swinging one way and then they let go. And there's this period of time where they're just in the air. Right. And I was explaining this to another dear friend of mine who was going through a struggle. And because we were talking about, there was something she was just holding on to. And it clearly was in the past. It was no longer present. It was in the past. And we got to talking about what it feels like to let go. And we think letting go is this wonderful thing, but it's frightening. You're not holding on to anything. You don't have any direction. You don't have this. And it takes time before that other handle comes and you hold on to it. And perhaps eventually spirituality means we're not actually even holding on to a handle ever. You eventually get to where you're just, if a handle comes, you hold it very loosely for a while and then let it go. And then the next handle, perhaps that's, it seems to me in my experience that that's one aspect of what the spiritual process is you're not gripping onto anything too strongly. But, yeah, it's difficult because you let go and there's a rush in letting go, but anything new has fear to it. And having that trust and having that sense of even if I die, it'll be okay. Right. And it doesn't have to be the answers that I think I'm seeking. I don't have to get this exactly. And so, yeah, that's,
You shared a very profound statement. Even to receive grace, vulnerability needs to be there. So that's very profound. And this was also a reminder to the people, because even recently, a lot of people are committing suicides all over the world, and we all know that. And recently, even a couple of business people jumped off the bridge over here, some famous bridges. And these are well-established business owners and everyone. So the point being is, when you are in a problem, it's so difficult for people to even ask for help. So that transition, that step, that vulnerability you open up just to ask for help, that itself, for a lot of people, it takes a lot of courage to just ask, hey, can you help me? So what you mentioned is a little aspect of that awareness, and a feminine aspect, whether it's a man or a woman, it does not matter. If we bring that, maybe a lot of perspective, a lot of lives also can be saved. Or not just saved, why saved? Even a lot of people can be happy with their well-being and everything, relationships. Now coming to the relationship that you gave a very good example as well. I would like to understand, you have been on both sides of the coin, right? So when I say both sides of the coin, that means, let's say you have been in relationship before getting into spirituality, you were a different kind of person. And after this, how has your perspective about being in a relationship with somebody changed over the years? And what has been your biggest experience that you would like to share for the people who are actually struggling with relationships and still have no idea what's wrong, what's wrong with them?
Before I get into that, I would even say that admitting that there's a problem would be a first step to vulnerability, because you have these very successful business people. You have these people who have achieved what most people would kill for, would die for. They've achieved these things. And to be in a place where you look at yourself and you say, but it's not enough. Something's wrong. Something doesn't fit. Something doesn't work. And I would say to admit it to yourself is one thing. To admit it externally, if some big businessman came, what's the guy's name? Ambani, that big business, like he's some huge, is that the right name? The guy in Mumbai that just had the wedding,
Ambani, yes.
Ambani, if he comes and says, well, something's wrong, I'm just not satisfied, is he going to get empathy from your common person? No, you have yachts, you have this, you have that. No, but something's wrong. Something doesn't fit. Who are you to complain about? I'm starving, which is actually a valid point. Like, there is a valid point to be made there, but to come to that understanding within yourself and to come to that truth, because the fact of the matter is it doesn't work. You go and you get successful and you think all of these things are going to cascade as a result of it, and it doesn't. And a certain desperation sinks in. And I've seen that amongst some very successful people, that there's a certain desperation of, I've tried everything and it doesn't work. And so being vulnerable and being open at that point within yourself and saying, okay, something is wrong. Something isn't adding up. And then taking the next step and talking to people about it. It's immense. It really is this immense thing, especially to someone in that position, because there's very little compassion. And maybe the person has lived their life in such a way that they're doing these hard business deals, they're doing this, they're doing that, and they're like a shark. And so then they come out and they say something's wrong, and people are going to say, well, you've done these business deals. Like, say if Donald Trump came out and was, well, I'm not satisfied, right? Well, you haven't paid your subcontractors. You've done this, you've done that, you've attacked people, these sorts of things. But also having a sense within ourselves and growing as a community and as a society where we can say, okay, it's okay to recognize growth. It's okay to recognize change. It's okay to think that people can fundamentally change. And I think that comes to the relationship question, because I'm not who I was when I started this stuff. I went through this period where, with my family, where I felt like an outsider, because the way they look at the world, the way they are, is very different from the way I look at the world, the way I experience the world even. And so I felt like this outsider who, it's kind of like you don't have a home. You don't have a place, and you go to the ashram and you think the ashram's going to be it. And then the floors are concrete and you're sleeping on a mat, and it's, you're tired, and then you go home and that's not it either. So you're kind of this in between. But what's happened for me over the last couple of years is got to this sense that basically I'm home wherever I am, and I can be with my family, and I don't expect them to understand. I don't expect them to meditate. I don't expect them to do anything. I just am able to be with them for who they are. We'll speak present tense, who they are, and allow them to be themselves, and not expect them to take a yoga program, not expect them to understand why I do these things. And relationships, relationships are going to be work no matter whether you're doing spirituality or not. They're going to take investment, they're going to take time. And what you can do is really look at a person and see what that person needs. I think a lot of times we get into relationships for our own needs, whatever those may be. We'll not go into all those. Everybody knows the needs people get into relationships for. There can be many different reasons, but you get into it because you have a craving within yourself. But the maturity is you see the other person's needs. You see what the other person desires from it. You see that, and you're able to, instead of saying, oh, well, now I'm doing yoga and meditating and I'm happier and I don't have needs, so I'm not going to value this relationship. You can say, well, I don't really have that many needs. Let me see what I can do for this person. And I think people struggle in relationships because somebody starts doing practices, and it starts off with 30 minutes. And then you're like, oh, well, this is doing well. So let me learn another thing. Then you're at 45 minutes and let me learn one thing more. And then you're at an hour and 45 minutes. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, I do 4 hours in the morning and an hour in the evening. Why are you not accepting me? But if the person saw the fruits of that, if the person saw that you're becoming this more beautiful, compassionate person, you're able to listen to them and understand, you're able to provide for them the things that they need, I think that the majority of people would think that's wonderful. Now, if you're just saying, well, I'm just doing sadhana and I'm not going to work, and you take care of the kids and that sort of stuff, well, no, they're not going to understand that. But if you're able to just say, okay, well, I'm taking this time for myself, so let me make sure I'm planning time. Let me make sure I'm listening to the person, saying, well, how do we step forward into this? Like, this is important to me. How can we do it so you understand that you're also important to me? The kids are also important to me if you have kids. These things, and really learning to listen, right? There's so many people who want to express themselves, but if you've chosen to be in a relationship, listen to what that other person's saying. Yes, there's that 5% of people that these things may not work. And that's a different scenario. But I mean, I think it's like that with anything in life. People lose their joy, people lose their passion, people lose that sort of stuff as it gets to be something that they see every day. Nobody gets excited and they're like, well, I'm going to go see a sunrise, right? Or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. It's just, oh, sun's up, sun's down. I'm going to take a breath. That's exciting. I'm breathing today. So yeah, I think that in a relationship, learning to, you're doing your spiritual practice, you're doing, if it's Isha, that's great. If you're, doing Buddhism, if you're doing whatever you're doing, that's great. It should improve the quality of your life and it should improve the lives around you. Now there are times when you step into certain things that speed things up, that make it difficult for a time. And if you're somebody who has a partner that supports you in that and can, when the bumps come, they're able to manage that with you, you better support them even more, right? Like if you're going through struggles internally and there's someone who loves you and cares for you enough to be like, you're my partner, you're my wife, you're my husband, I'm going to support you through this, you better take care of that person, because otherwise, what are you doing? Right? Like, you think it's going to be easier just being single? I mean, even the thing of, if I'm doing all this practice and say I had a wife and I was going through struggles and she was just kind of like cooking things and taking care of things, even saying, listen, I know I'll bring this to my life. So, this was about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was going through some intense personal stuff. There was some family stuff going on. And then there was some work stuff going on, and it was situations I could not get out of. It was situations I was stuck in. And they were pretty extreme situations in a certain way. And I was dating somebody, and she would come to me and she'd say, you're not being a good boyfriend right now. And I said, I know. I am struggling basically for survival at the moment. I am not keeping my head above water, and I am not being a good partner. And I'm sorry. And she left, and she stole a bunch of my stuff when she left. So that compounded
a bunch of stuff. Okay.
She stole a bunch of my stuff. So that compounded things. I'm glad I can laugh about it now, but at the time I was like, what is going on? And she basically, I texted her. I said, what? And she goes, yeah, well, you weren't good to me these last 2 months. And I said, I know that. Do you understand the situations I was going through? And she was just like, yeah, well, you should have been better to me. I think it was like $5,000 or $10,000 worth of stuff she took. So, yeah, no, she took quite a bit of my stuff. And, but if you have somebody where you're going through these struggles, and they look at you and they want to support you, they look at you and they want you to do well, they look at you and they have that compassion, you at least have the awareness to say, well, I'm struggling with stuff, And I've stepped into certain things that accelerate things. For instance, for me, for a long time, when I started to do a bunch of Surya Shaktis, it just would intensify things insanely. And it would just like, there'd be bumps in the road. I was fortunately single at that time. But still am, but fortunately or unfortunately. But so if you have somebody who during those times you can kind of sit in their shade, at the very least express your appreciation. Yes, I'm going through this. Yes, your understanding of it. Yes, you're still here and facilitating my life in so many ways, and you can make it into a beautiful thing. And I think that is like developing that grace within yourself, that even when you're going through a hard time, you have the awareness of, it's difficult for me, and maybe I'm not showing up in this relationship like I should be. Because that's going to happen in any relationship. There's going to be times where one person is doing well. There'll be times where both people are doing well. There'll be times when one of the partners doing well, and there'll be times when both of the partners are doing well. And each of those takes a different thing. When both people are doing well, enjoy that ride. It doesn't usually last that long. When one of the partners is doing well, somebody's got to pick up the slack. Like somebody has to take care of things. And it should be where you have the willingness and the awareness within yourself to say, yeah, I'm not doing well. Thank you for doing that. Or I see that you're not doing well. I'm not going to take that personally. I'm going to see how to facilitate things for you because I'm doing well. And if both of you are in like a dark place, then you have to be able to say, look, we're both struggling. Let's do the best we can.
So basically,
and I think that,
yeah, please carry on.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that that's getting out of that kind of, it's just about me, and really including the other person in kind of everything that there is. I mean, even you're doing your spiritual practice and you're doing it by yourself, you can be inclusive of the other person. Not that you're focusing on it during your sadhana, but you can be, you're done. You have to be inclusive of the other person. It's not, oh, I'm doing this and I'm doing well and you're not, and you should do Shambhavi. No, it's not that. You want your person to do Shambhavi. You want your partner to do Shambhavi. I'm doing well. Let me see how to make your life a little more beautiful. Let me see how to make myself more beautiful. But let me see how to do those little thoughtful things that'll be like, the person will be like, oh, well, that's something that they haven't done. Wonderful.
It's amazing. So whatever kind of relationship it is, it's like make the other person more important than you. So you become like a giver to the person. So you will always think about what that person needs above your needs. So maybe that will create the balance when both are thinking about both of them. So there won't be any maybe gap areas or expectations which are very unrealistic. So
I think that's vulnerability too. You know, yes. If you're able to put somebody's needs above yourself, and I do think that's exploitable. You know, that is truly exploitable by people. But if you're able to do it in a sense where you just say, I'm willing to be exploited, in the sense of, I would rather, and I made this choice at one point in my life, because like I said, being vulnerable in my family was not something that was really accepted or allowed. And I realized that, and I was out in the world, and I was really, really, really good at seeing when other people were hurting, or seeing when somebody was struggling, and you know, taking them under my wing a little bit. I remember I had this friend in high school, and he was, I think we were 16, and he was kind of crazy, one of those party kids in high school. And we get to talking. He was super smart guy, super sharp. We get to talking, and I learned that he started doing heroin. And I took him aside and I said, listen, that's something that you can't come back from. You do that long enough, it changes your chemistry. You can't come back from that. You need to stop that. He kind of looks at me because I was this seemingly laid back. I had this facade of being laid back and just kind of not really getting into other people's business that much. And he just kind of looks at me and I said, listen, like do what you do, but realize there's certain lines, once you go far enough past them, you're not able to come back from that. And so it was 3 months later, and I just get this phone call. I mean, we're in school together. He never told me these things, but he just said, Josh, thank you so much for that conversation. I've been in Narcotics Anonymous. I've been clean for 3 months. Like, it means a lot that you said that. And to me, I didn't even register, right? It's a friend who I see is doing something that's going to be damaging later on. And there was other things that happened that I realized it's better to be vulnerable and be hurt than it is to just wall yourself off completely, right? Living like that, completely shut down, versus saying, all right, well, this way of living leaves me open to certain things, especially, like I've said it before, in the society that we're in. It leaves you open to certain things. Somebody does something and I just say, well, that's a good business person because, he's just using the market or whatever it is. So making that conscious decision of, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable and open and still having discretion. So there was somebody who I was doing a little bit of business with. I guess it was coming out of Hatha Yoga School last year, and there was an initiative I wanted to do. So I contacted him, and he's very, very active on social media. He's got a whole bunch of followers and stuff. And so I contacted him. I was like, hey, let's do this collaboration. This is something we can do to push forward for the new year, these sorts of things. He's like, that's a great idea. Next day I see a post of his and he's taken my idea and just put it out as his, and he's, run away with it. And I looked at it and on one hand, I can understand that, like, the scarcity that he's going through of, he really wants to make this Hatha Yoga business happen for himself. He really wants to do that. And it wasn't even that great of an idea. It was an okay idea. I don't know that it would have been a wonderful thing, but I was like, hey, we can get a couple of us newly graduated Hatha Yoga teachers together and we can do this. So it was that. And it took a couple of days for me to get to a place where I saw him and was just like, okay, well, maybe he's struggling for money. Maybe he's struggling for these sorts of things. And he's really trying to make something happen. And get that compassion and openness and be like, okay, well, I'll be open to him. On the other hand, he hasn't earned my trust back yet, in the sense that for actions that I take, he'll be on the periphery in terms of action. In terms of how I see him as a person, I'm open and vulnerable and have compassion for who he is. But I also have the discretion to see that if somebody's willing to do that, the trust can't be there. The trust in terms of action. If I'm doing another business thing, which a couple of us are, we're doing some video stuff. If I'm doing this stuff, then I can't trust him to be part of the process. I'll have to say, these are aspects where we can use you and you're on the outside, but I can't pull you in and just have it be completely like, this is what we're doing, because, well, I don't need to say because of his actions. And so having that openness where you see that compassion, you see that person, even in a relationship, you see that compassion for somebody and you realize that, okay, this is their limited nature. This is who they are. This is what they're able to give. And you can kind of hold them within that. And some relationships will just flourish, even if you're able to do that. If you understand and give the person what they're able to give and see them for who they are. And then some just happen to be, unfortunately, you outgrow them. And it's the unfortunate thing that, if you look at life and how short it is, there's a short amount of time to do so many things. Like, there's so much to do in life. And some people, I use this phrase, nothing against the people who do this. Some people want to come home after work, watch Netflix, and work, watch Netflix, eat out, and that's their life. Wonderful for you. That's great. I couldn't be in a relationship with somebody like that because, I'm doing these podcasts. I've got some films we're pitching. I've got some films we're trying to make. I've got like a couple other business things we're trying to do. And so I come home and I do my sadhana, and then it would be like, okay, well, I'm going to spend an hour and 15 minutes with you. And then I'm going to go probably start writing or this or that. Maybe, we vacations and things like that. But, I'm also maybe going into a long period of silence next year. Who's going to want to be like, yeah, go away for a period of time and come back and I won't hear from you. Like it brings certain difficulties when you get really, really into it. But most people, I feel like it's an excuse to like, this person's not working versus, okay, there's a little friction here. Let me see how to make myself into a beautiful person and have it be a beautiful experience for that person. I would say that's 98% of people. If you're somebody who is doing 7 or 8 hours of sadhana a day and you have that like deep, intense desire that you can't do anything about, and you're just like throwing yourself into it, my sympathies to you, because it makes relationships hard.
So, like you mentioned, two people can be completely different, yet very understanding or respectful of each other's lives and that understanding. So, everything maybe boils down to, just like you mentioned, vulnerability, understanding, being a giver, and of course, having that space, because ultimately you cannot control the person in front of you. You only have control on yourself. So, that's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. With so much of wisdom.
And along with being a giver, before you kind of pivot, along with being a giver, receiving with grace. Like what you receive, you recognize that you receive it. You recognize what it brings to your life and the gratitude that's there. So I think that's something that's missing too. Like you're a giver, but you also recognize when you're receiving and what you receive, and understanding that in some way it enhances your life. If it didn't, most relationships wouldn't happen. If there wasn't something that you're receiving, most people wouldn't be in a relationship like that.
No, that's a very good point, because a lot of people have struggle receiving things, When I say things, I mean just
a lot of men.
Yeah, so they can't receive it properly. Even it just feels like a barrier. Even if you give, they are not able to receive because they have never done that previously. Or they feel that if I receive it, I might look weak. So that is a very good point that you added over here. So receiving
I might look weak, and then I might owe you something. Like if it's transactional, right? If it's transactional, I might owe you something. And one of the most beautiful things for me, shifts that happen, is if somebody's giving me something, if somebody's offering me something, I just accept it like this without any sense that I owe the person anything. And it feels like there's this paradoxical nature to it, because it feels like that's going to create friction. Right? It feels like that's going to create friction. But in any relationship, somebody's going to give more than somebody else gives. That's just the nature of it. Somebody's going to give more than somebody else gives. And so rather than looking at it as like, well, you're giving, so now I have to give. That's not the place to do it. If we just take like abstract numbers and say we're in a relationship and you give me 5, whatevers. And then but I'm able to give you just like one completely and fully. Then it's not transactional, right? You wouldn't be sitting there thinking, well, I did these 5 things for him. Say we're in a relationship and you cook and you do all this sort of stuff, and I come home and I eat, and then I go out and I come home with this flower, and I'm just like, honestly, like from my heart, thank you so much. Like it means so much that you add this to my life. You're not going to be like, well, I did 10 things and he just got me a flower. You're going to be like, oh, that's incredible.
That's a great point, which brings me to the aspect which I have been meaning to ask in the last time, but time was not there. So how many years, because that's a question that other people might also be wanting to hear, how many years, because, you have a very rich experience, wisdom, or whatever you may want to call it. So how many years you have been with Sadhguru or doing the volunteering activities? If you can please share certain details. Let's say, for example, what are some of the things that you can share which outside people does not know with your experience working with Sadhguru?
You say wisdom. And I think any wisdom that I have comes from, if you'd call it wisdom, just I've been the biggest fool there is in so many ways, right? Like I've made all the mistakes. Maybe someone who didn't make all the mistakes wouldn't understand them quite so well. So I think in terms of any of what you might call wisdom, I think that's really what it comes down to, is I've had to look at things and understand things and say, why am I doing this? But I took inner engineering in 2008 in August. So I just reached 16 years. Can't believe it's been that long. And I can't say that I've been that close to Sadhguru. I haven't. I've just been fortunate enough to happen to be in situations where he was there. There's so many people who have been around him so much more, and I don't have any special insight or knowledge or anything. I mean, even to the point that for a long time, I wondered if he knew who I was, in that sense. Like I've gotten silence from him. I've asked him questions. There's certain things, but there's people who are in group situations, who he talks to, who he's friendly to, who he's making jokes with and gets to know them as a person. Now, part of this was a choice on my part. I did a program with his sister-in-law in 2009, and we became friends. She's this wonderful lady from Bangalore. I think she's from Bangalore, and we became very friendly. His Sadhguru's older brother's wife, and she's got a lovely family, daughter who's here in a couple hours from me. I actually saw her a couple months ago, and it was so lovely to run into her. And at one point, she invites me to some gathering that was happening. And she's like, do you want to come? Sadhguru will be there. It'll be very intimate. And I remember I looked at it and I realized I don't want him as a friend. I don't want him. I don't want to go hang out with him. That's not what I want from him. And so I actually turned down the invitation. I was like, thank you so much, but no. And through the years, there's been so many situations where he just like ignores me. I don't exist. And so in terms of like special insight or special anything like that, really there's one situation where we were there was a book signing or a book tour that I was volunteering for, and somebody that I knew wanted to get a signature. And so I volunteered, and then at the end he was doing signings, and I came up with the book, and I was in the crowd, and he just kind of signing and looking, and then he just looks at me, and he gives me this look. What are you doing? Getting a book signed, right? Like, look, like that. Just this long, kind of intense stare. And then he just kind of gave this half smile and nodded and signed it. It's like, okay, maybe he does know who I am, but yeah, like I don't know in terms of volunteering. It's funny because there are people who get these amazing experiences from volunteering and giving of themselves and doing all that sort of stuff. And it's never been that for me. For me, it's just been, I see the value. I see why this is needed in the world so desperately. And so therefore the volunteering that I can give, I'll give. The time that I can give, I'll give. And it's interesting, like over these last couple, I was really into volunteering, and then I fell off for a long time, and it slowly started coming back into my life. But I don't think I have any special insights. I think if you look at it and you see the value, for me, I had a friend recently who was in this PhD program. She's become a doctor. She's just this like, it just is amazing to me seeing her come out of undergrad. And that's when we became friends. We were working together. And then she went through grad school for 4 years. And then she went and did her PhD, and she wrote her thesis, and she's doing this wonderful work in research. So after she graduated, she was living in Italy. She came back and we had dinner. And she just mentioned, she says, well, yeah, I'm going to get my mom to take engineering. And I kind of looked at her. I said, wait. And then I had to think, and I was like, oh, yes, I definitely had recommended her do engineering at a time. I had completely forgot. And I said, you still do your practice? She goes, I do it every day. It kept me sane through graduate school. It kept me sane through 7 years of PhD work, and it helped me. And so she just kind of quietly did it. It wasn't making a show of it, but that tells me the value that's there. And so if you see something valuable, you want to nurture it. And so for me, that's what volunteering is. Maybe on some level I receive something from it. I don't know all the intricacies or the details of what it is, but for me, if I see something, a weed will just grow in the garden. A weed will just grow. It doesn't take cultivating. A beautiful flower takes a certain amount of cultivating. It takes pulling up the weeds. It takes, maybe it takes fertilizer. Maybe it takes watering. If there's a dry spell, a rose bush may wither. Well, a weed may flourish, right? Like, so if there's something that's like that you see is beautiful in the world, then I think the responsibility is on us to nurture it. And I think that in terms of, we've been talking about the feminine and the masculine, and the feminine aspects of art and music and these sorts of things, and looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is absolutely beautiful. It's not just entertainment. There's actually artistic value to it. I want to support this. I want to do that. I think that sensibility is needed in a very big way. That our actions are in a certain sense votes for how we want to make the world work, how we want to move it forward. I mentioned this in actually one of the other podcasts I did. There's she was a Sanskriti student, and she does these wonderful paintings. Absolutely, like, they're so vibrant. And part of me, like, if I had a platform, I would somehow try to make it so people could buy these, so she could be supported in creating this art. And I think that's part of anything we're doing is you take you take what is beautiful and what needs supportive, and you water it and you fertilize it, and you say, this is valuable to the world and it's valuable to me.
That is profound. That is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned you are into business. You have multiple things going on in parallel. Um, how has the practices, when I say the practices, the sadhana, why? Because I see the reason for asking this question is I see a lot of people who are struggling through a lot of problems in their life, personal and professional. Typically, again, the business owners, right? And they say, okay, I don't have time for this, that, etc. But I would like to ask from you as a business owner as well, how has the sadhana, or even let's say inner engineering, or even smallest things that you do on this path, has actually made a shift in your life in terms of your business?
Strictly from a logical standpoint, having clarity of thought, being able to see situations, being able to understand situations. I mean, that can lead you to a certain amount of success where you're able to perceive
Clarity,
kind of
decision making.
clarity, yeah, and what is needed, right? And a lot of the times, the way people think and the way people act isn't necessarily logical. So if you can see that and you can see a need, a lot of people will say, well, I want to do business because this is what I love to do. But you also look at the market, you look at what's there, you can really see clearly, okay, well, there's a need for this in the market. There's a need for this. It's not just, hey, I want to make a bunch of money, but there's actually a need for this. So there's that aspect to it. But for me, the most profound thing is when you step into a situation not trying to extract something from somebody else. And usually in business, I'm sitting across the table from you. I'm negotiating against you. And yes, that has to happen sometimes. Like there are certain situations where absolutely it's me versus you on those levels. I fortunately, in my businesses or in the areas where I work, I don't look at it as a zero sum game, even though there is, if you look at film and TV, there's definitely an amount of scarcity in film and TV that only certain projects get made. But my thought is if you make yourself truly competent, if you make yourself undeniable, then you don't really have to compete. So the sadhana, I think it makes it so you can step in with a certain sense of inclusiveness. And what I've noticed that's really weird is if you can step in with a certain sense of inclusiveness, it's not me versus you, right? It's not us. I'm working with this, I'm doing kind of a mentorship with this really, really established writer. And he's writing he's helping me on stuff. And I express this, like, this is phenomenal. If this thing gets made, I'll have you on as an executive producer credit. And he's like, don't do that. He's like, thank you so much for offering, but don't do that. Like, get it made, get established, and then hire me as a writer if it gets made, or these sorts of things. And I think he was just surprised, because for me, it's saying, how can we work together to make something amazing, and approaching it like that. And I think there's a different form of success that can stem from that. It's a much longer term game plan. Maybe it won't sell the script maybe it won't sell the TV show that's like immediately on my plate. But if people like you, trust you, you build those connections, and you're willing to do stuff for them, in terms of you're not just trying to. I had a friend come over and we were looking through what's called a pitch deck, and he wanted to show me a pitch deck, which is basically, do you know anything about decks in terms of business? Like, you make the deck. So yeah, it's like that for a film. And I looked through it, and then sat down with him for about 45 minutes to do some restructuring of it with some words, so like the way it was phrased and the way certain things were presented, and there were certain things that needed smoothing out. And then it got to about 45 minutes, and I said, "Listen, I would love to continue on this. I don't have the bandwidth to like keep doing this unless I'm part of the project, right? But I'm not saying I have to be part of the project to give you 45 minutes. It was, I sat down, I did it, I realized I was short on time, and then I said, listen, I'm sorry, but I'm too busy now to work on projects that aren't my projects, right? Like I can lend you a little bit of a hand, but I can't jump on board and do this. And even if he came to me and said, well, I want you as part of the project, come on as an executive producer, do these sorts of things, I don't even know if I have the bandwidth to do that. But the sense of inclusion, and he's a friend, and even if it wasn't a friend, if it wasn't a good friend that I knew, maybe I'd sit down with 10 minutes and say, well, here's what I see here, here's what I see there. I think, and maybe we'll have another conversation in a year where I can verify it, but it feels like there's a certain traction that's happening on quite a few different levels, on quite a few different areas. Like, it's not like I'm here and I've got it all here. I've got quite a few different little contacts. And it feels like there's traction that's happening, but I'm not having to push it forward. I'm not having to drive things forward. And so we'll see in terms of tangible results, but that's just the way I have to approach things now. It's not me trying to say, well, you're this established writer, so let me take everything I can. No, let me receive everything that you're offering. But also, for me, I recognize the value in what he's doing. I recognize the value of his time. I recognize all that sort of stuff. And I think he was kind of surprised that I was like, hey, come on, as an executive producer, you're excited about this idea. Like, I would love to have you involved. He's like, don't just give the store away, right? Don't just do that. Like, you can't do that. Even though if it got picked up, I would see about if he's willing to use kind of his connections and get it picked up. I definitely see how to, maybe not on this one, but on the next one, see how to, okay, you helped me. Let me see if I can help you. That sounds transactional. It's not, let me see if I can, I want to be inclusive of you in what I'm doing based on that. It's not, let me see if I can do more for you than you did for me, but it's like, it's so helpful, the things that you have done. I want you to be included if I have success. That's a better way to put it, because the first way wasn't quite right.
Yeah. So no, absolutely. Because you mentioned about the clarity, the stability, because what is business? I think it's all about decision making. Even whatever you're thinking, whatever you're doing, whatever you are not doing, even that's your decision making. So if you do not have that stability somewhere within you and that clarity within you, and I don't think, forget about the business, I don't think even you or anybody else cannot even work with you. So that's a great way to put it across. Anything that
along those lines,
yeah,
being able to say no, right? So this friend who came to me with a project, I hope it works. I hope it's wonderful and it works, but recognizing that my time is limited and I can't say yes to everything right now. I can't. And even in the situation that I'm in right now, where this one podcast went semi-viral, and I'm kind of surprised because other people have been reaching out. I'm just like, I think
thanks to Stephen.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm at a point where I'm like, I can't say yes to, I have to look at it and say, in my schedule, what time do I have to devote towards this? What time do I have to to give and be honest and just say, you know, I can't right now, like check back with me for 3 months, check back with me for 6 months. And say, like, you can say no, or you can say not right now, but being able to say in life, so I also run a business with swim lessons where we have people teaching swim lessons, and someone reached out to me, wanted me to do something. And I just looked at it and I was like, I don't see how I have time. I can't. So being able to say no gracefully and just be like, listen, I'm sorry. I would thank you for the opportunity. This isn't for me right now. All the best to you in business. And when you first are starting out in anything, you basically say yes to everything. And then as you go, you have to learn how to gracefully say no. Right. And I think that the sadhana has given me that, where it's not every opportunity I have to take. I mean, even in terms of, for me, it's 1:15. So it's 1:15. I look at it and I'm like, well, for me, it's important to be up and doing my sadhana and have a life where it's structured and scheduled around this. Like, I see the value it brings in my life. And so having that in terms of what I do for business, in terms of all that, that is, that's how I've said about my life. And because I held it so firmly that this is what's important to me. What's basically happened for me is, this is what's important to me. And I've been able to manage my life in such a way that the other things fit in, the business fits in.
Yeah.
These other things happen, and make myself in such a way that hopefully people enjoy being around me a little bit, and I add value to what they're doing. And then you make yourself indispensable on a couple different aspects. You know, you make yourself indispensable in terms of, for instance, and I don't know that this will happen, but this guy who's mentoring me, I wrote a film. He really likes the film. And so we're working on trying to make it happen. And last night we had a conversation and he just completely shifted. He's like, well, it's a great idea. It's a great story, but these are the ways to make it more commercial for Hollywood. Like, this could potentially be a big hit if you can do these things, if you can do that. And it totally changed the story. And then he was like, I'm sorry, I'm throwing so much information at you. And I said, no, like, I have to be, in business, they call it pivot. I have to be able to just pivot. I have to be able to just, okay, well, yeah, it would be great to make the movie that's in my heart and I see, but it would also be kind of cool to make a movie that made $200 million, say, something like this, right? Like, if you can pivot and say, somebody who's in a position of influence says, look, this can be done. And I feel like, I don't know if this is happening, but I know within the industry, if people are able to be flexible, you can get hired on for stuff, right? Like, you can, if you're not stuck, they call it killing the baby. You have to kill the baby sometimes. And that sounds so morbid, but you have to be willing to say, okay, well, this is what I thought it was going to be, but the people with the money are saying it needs to be this. So I'm willing to kill my baby. I'm willing. It's not rock your baby. It's kill your baby. I don't know what that would be in Sanskrit. No, that's not. Sorry. Oh man! Lots of school is going to be calling me and saying, Joshua, like, what are you doing? Like, kill the baby asana? That's not a thing we teach. So yes, in film, when you're writing, and it might be in novels too, they call it kill the baby. So you have these things that are just precious to you in a script or in a story, and sometimes they're great scenes, but they don't fit the story. They don't actually move the narrative forward. And so it's these babies that we create. When you create something that's beautiful, you tend to cling to it. And so I'm curious, because he threw all these ideas at me, and I'm wondering if he's like, maybe he's testing me. I don't know. Maybe he's just like, let me throw all this stuff at you. But I'm excited because at the end, he's like, I'm so sorry. I just threw all this stuff at you. I did that. I'm like, no, like, let's see what can be done. Let's shift and like put it in a different gear and write this thing that's maybe not the story I wanted to write or that I initially thought, but I also kind of want to challenge myself and see if I can do that and shift. So in terms of business too, like having that, to bring it all back around, to having that, like you're sitting somewhere where having that ability to pause and look at it, vulnerability to ask yourself, is this working? Is this working for me? Is this working in business? Is this actually working? And then having the flexibility to change and the clarity to see the direction you need to go. And so I think in terms of business, if all businesses acted like that, and then even if it is working, especially at a certain point, is it beneficial for the world? Is it making the world a better place? Are we contributing to humanity in the direction I want to go, or are we not? And I think people get caught up in the idea of doing something. And at first you kind of do anything, if you're writing this, maybe you hop on this. At some point, especially once you get established, and I think this is where the business people who are jumping off bridges and like you get established, but you don't have a why. Why am I doing this? And making money isn't a why, or it isn't a sustainable why. I don't think. Like you can, once you reach a point where you've made enough money, if your why is making money, and you're like, now what? So all of this stuff, like vulnerability, clarity. And for me, the sadhana has made it so, and someone asked me why I do Isha. And for me, like Isha has worked for me. It's made it so I'm able to be vulnerable and open. It made it so my relationships are good. It's made it so my business, we trained someone new yesterday and she looks at me, she goes like, this doesn't feel like work. And I said, it shouldn't, you should come here and enjoy it and have fun. And I don't want it to feel like work. I want to hire people who recognize that that's an atmosphere that should promote or should lead you to push yourself further, not lead you to try to exploit the situation.
Wow. And just like you mentioned, ability to say no. I mean, so many people struggle with that. And I think to say no, that also needs clarity. That also needs stability within you. Otherwise, you won't be able to say no and then not feel guilty about it or not regret about it or not be anxious about it. Now what? So I think you have put it in a very interesting perspective with of course, the example. And before we wrap up, anything that you would like to share with our listeners and viewers?
I think it would be interesting, actually, like once the first podcast is released, if there is interest to talk about Devi.
Devi, of course, I would love to. And not just Devi, I have some other aspects as well. So maybe we will come up with part 3. So thank you for sharing that aspect. I'll definitely keep it in mind. So people who are watching and listening, wait for it because he's going to come up with something amazing. And that podcast will be particularly on Bhairavi Devi. So thank you.
Well, especially given that the US Devi is coming.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I think the Bangalore Devi is coming, right? And Devi is something that I think I have an odd relationship with.
Just like Sadhguru predicted, she's going to be more famous than Yalinga. So nothing taking on that. So of course, you can't run away from that. And thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And I would definitely once again say thanks to Stefan over here itself.
Yes.
Right. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm definitely looking forward to our different conversation for our part 3 for the next episode. Thank you so much, Joshua.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.